Cheryl Ladd still won't talk to her former co-star decades later. What went wrong between two of the biggest names on TV? The reality is deeper, darker, and more intimate than anyone could have ever imagined, so stay tuned. Cheryl Ladd's journey to fame wasn't easy before she became well-known. She didn't get her big break overnight, and she wasn't born into celebrity. She actually began her career as a singer, providing voices for animated cartoons, rather than as an actress. She was the singing voice of Melody on Josie and the Pussycats in the early 1970s, but most fans are unaware of this. It was far from glamorous, but it paid the bills. She worked on low-budget projects, guest appearances, and anything else that would help her realize her dream for years. Hollywood is sometimes a cruel place. Additionally, Cheryl felt as though time was passing quickly. The proper opportunity kept eluding her, despite her talent and attractive appearance. Friends said that when the phone eventually rung, she was about to take it all in. It was Charlie's Angels that called. The popularity of the show had just skyrocketed, but problems were already developing. After just one season, America's sweetheart and breakout star, Farrah Fawcett, had made the decision to depart. The producers were rushing around. It was dangerous, if not impossible, to replace someone like Farrah, but they were desperate to maintain the pace. They decided on Cheryl Ladd at that point. She was not portraying the same role, and her task was to take center stage and attempt to win over an audience that was still fixated on Farrah's every move. She would be identified as the younger sister of Farrah. An ingenious method of continuity, but a dangerous one. The pressure came instantly. Supporters weren't convinced. Not everyone on set embraced her, and the media was unrelenting, but Cheryl handled it gracefully. She arrived on time, smiled during interviews, and gave her lines with ease. Ratings stayed high as viewers gradually came to accept her. It appeared to be a success story on the surface. However, a much darker scenario was beginning to emerge behind the scenes. The emotional burden that Cheryl endured in quiet was something that many people were unaware of. There was a tinge of discomfort in every smile. Each sequence that was filmed was an additional endurance test. Because it would be much more difficult for Cheryl to blend in with the cast than to win over the audience. The energy changed as soon as Cheryl stepped onto the stage. Cheryl was perceived by some as an outsider, attempting to fill shoes that no one wanted replaced, despite her professionalism and charisma. Farrah Fawcett's departure had left a noticeable void. Although she was warmly received by the producers, not everyone on set was as excited. At first, there was no loud or dramatic tension. It was subtly done. A rapid walk past her in the hallway without even saying hello, a chilly look, and a missing grin. Always polite in public, Cheryl subsequently acknowledged that her first few days on Charlie's Angels seemed more like treading carefully than becoming a sisterhood. Among the initial trio, one co-star in particular appeared very aloof. Members of the crew started chatting about the cold air. Cheryl frequently received brief responses or courteous nods in response to her attempts at informal conversation. Cheryl sat by herself with her screenplay between breaks, while the other angels crowded together. Others detected something more profound, a subliminal resistance to accepting her, while others dismissed it as the strain of a high-pressure performance. And it wasn't just the cast. There were repercussions. Some crew members took their cues from the more seasoned celebs. Perhaps without realizing it, they mimicked Cheryl's exclusionary behavior. Cheryl seems to have been positioned on the outside of an imaginary line that had been drawn. Cheryl, however, was determined not to let it depress her. She continued to appear. She was able to memorize her lines. When scenes went over, she stayed late. In the hopes that it might gradually melt the ice, she brought kindness to the set. It has nothing to do with ego. Cheryl didn't want to be the best. All she wanted was to perform her duties and contribute to something worthwhile. However, despite her best efforts, one individual flatly refused to let her in. And every week that went by, Cheryl felt it more and more. The long hours, the lack of communication, and the mounting realization that she would never be treated as an equal and would always be viewed as a replacement, regardless of how well she worked. And before long, that subdued tension would explode into something that was impossible to ignore. Kate Jackson was the source of the cold environment Cheryl Ladd encountered. Kate was regarded as the serious angel at the time. She had a strong creative voice behind the scenes and had contributed to the show's tone. However, intensity accompanied that influence. Additionally, Kate did not conceal her disapproval when Cheryl took center stage. Several set accounts state that Kate had publicly questioned Cheryl's selection, purportedly calling her a mere blonde Barbie doll. Not only did the words hurt, but the person who said them did as well. This wasn't small talk. Insiders continue to discuss the conflict between the two women decades later. Furthermore, personality was not the only factor. According to reports, Kate thought Cheryl's casting was a step toward style rather than depth and that the show had begun to lose its substance. Fair or not, it put up an imperceptible barrier between them that only got higher over time. Eye rolls and snide remarks were the first things that happened. Kate would ignore or interrupt Cheryl when she made recommendations. During rehearsals, Kate allegedly avoided eye contact during table reads. According to one crew member, the atmosphere was so chilly that you could see your breath. Cheryl remained silent, though. She wasn't there to create enemies since she thought the work should speak for itself. The third angel, Jacqueline Smith, was frequently caught in the midst. Even though she was friendly with both ladies, she could not help but notice the change in vibe when Cheryl and Kate were together. Cheryl eventually gave up attempting to make a connection. She remained professional, kept her distance, and concentrated on her scenes. However, bitterness tends to persist. It was evident that there was something developing beneath the surface. It appeared to be a power battle to those on the sidelines. The emotional center of the play has always been Kate. Even if it wasn't deliberate, Cheryl's entrance upset that equilibrium. Not everyone was prepared to adapt to the show's changes. Then came the day when everything came to a head. Cheryl Ladd was able to keep her head down and steer out of confrontation for a while. However, tension between her and Kate Jackson was at an all-time high, and even the calmest waters can conceal powerful undercurrents. The last straw was an episode that needed more practice time during production. Producers had urged Cheryl to take on a more central emotional arc and a few more lines after the script had undergone several rewrites. She was thrilled. It was an opportunity to establish herself as a genuine actress with substance, not just the new chick. But Kate had a different perspective. Several stories claim that she was incensed at the modifications. She thought that the writers were moving the focus in a way that felt betraying her, favoring Cheryl at her expense. Kate is said to have slammed down the final draft of the script and hurried off set when it was distributed. One of the most talked about events in the show's backstage history would be what transpired next. In a dressing room, Kate confronted Cheryl in private. They raised their voices. Crew members close to the scene reported hearing shouting, a door bang, and then stillness, though the precise words were never made public. Cheryl left a few minutes later, her eyes crimson and her body clearly frightened. For the remainder of the day, she did not come back. She had never stepped off the set before. The producers were rushing. Despite having a successful performance, their cast was disintegrating. An effort was made to mend the situation. There were meetings. An apology was offered, but Cheryl didn't want to get into another argument. She had had enough of attempting to appease someone who obviously did not desire peace. She didn't talk to Kate at all after that incident, unless they were filming a scene. Even experienced crew members found the shift shocking. Although the tension had always existed, it was now indisputable. Silent vehicle trips to promotional events, icy glares in between takes, and a backstage environment that resembled a courtroom more than a movie set. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. As usual, the episodes were broadcast. Insiders sensed something had changed, but the smiles remained. Cheryl had made up her decision, and what had been a quiet tension had become blatant animosity. She would be polite on camera, complete the season, and put in the work. However, any relationship with her co-star would end when the cameras stopped rolling, and for Cheryl, that choice would be permanent. Cheryl Ladd had the option to go public following the behind-the-scenes explosion. She had the opportunity to defend herself, give her side of the story, and draw attention to the abuse she received, but she chose not to. Rather, she opted for quiet. And that quiet grew louder than any headline from a tabloid. Cheryl continued to be the epitome of professionalism for the rest of her tenure on Charlie's Angels. She kept her emotions off camera, knew her lines, and showed up. However, she vanished from anything that required her to be in the same room with Kate Jackson after filming was finished. She skipped some of the cast photo shoots. In order to prevent Cheryl from attending some events, producers had to ensure that the two were seated apart. Fans detected anything odd in the early 2000s. In honor of the show's legacy, a number of former cast members got back together for tributes and interviews. But there was no sign of Cheryl. Her team provided evasive responses when questioned about scheduling issues, but insiders had other ideas. Cheryl didn't want to sit next to someone who had spent years making her feel inferior and unwanted. It was no accident that she wasn't there. It was a declaration. The tabloids started to conjecture. A long-standing feud was rekindled. According to some, it was never truly settled. Others thought Cheryl was merely defending herself out of self-respect rather than retaliation. In any case, admirers started to piece it together. Cheryl was obviously still feeling the effects of what had transpired. There was one thing she would never do, even though she had moved on with her life and profession: act as though it never occurred. Even after several decades, she still had a close relationship with Jacqueline Smith. The two continued to communicate, made appearances together at charity functions, and occasionally shared fond public recollections of the show. However, Cheryl's tone would change when Kate Jackson's name was mentioned in interviews. Her co-star was never disparaged by her. She never stoked controversy, but she also never backed down. Her consistency was what made it even more remarkable. Cheryl remained silent as other Hollywood feuds erupted and subsided over the years. She never denied that there had been hurt, but she did not encourage rumors. Her avoidance of certain subjects demonstrated that there was still sorrow beneath the surface, and it was obvious that something had happened that had crossed a boundary for her that could never be uncrossed. Initially, fans were too engrossed in the thrilling episodes to realize that something was amiss. Glossy network ads, high-stakes cases, and glitzy costumes served their purpose. However, as the seasons progressed, even casual viewers began to feel that something was wrong, particularly with Kate Jackson and Cheryl Ladd. Watchers with keen eyes started to read their body language. Situations in which their characters were awkwardly separated. There were times when one angel would talk and the other would hardly respond. There was a lot of conjecture in online forums, particularly in the early days of fan message boards. While some fans felt the truth was brewing just beneath the surface, others thought the characters were just scripted that way. Interviews followed. Cheryl took the time to reflect on her career in the early 2000s. In an obvious attempt to stir things up, the interviewer inquired as to whether she remained in contact with any of her former angels. After grinning and praising Jacqueline Smith, Cheryl asked, "And what about Kate Jackson?" She replied in a single word, "No." No elaboration, no explanation, just a firm, cool no. More than a 5-minute diatribe ever could, to be sure. Fans realized there was more to the tale after that. The clip was picked up by entertainment bloggers, and the headlines started to appear. Feud is still alive. Cheryl Ladd declines to get back in touch with her co-star. Theories exploded in the comment areas. Nearly everyone agreed, while some defended Cheryl and some attempted to speculate as to what had transpired. They didn't imagine the distance. It was still there and it was real. It was more fascinating because of Cheryl's meticulous handling of the subject. She never gave Kate a phony grin, but she also never openly insulted her. Even if it was slight, her honesty simply added to the mystery. Why, after all these years, was the wound still open? What specifically had transpired to prevent reconciliation? Viewers started rewatching previous episodes from a new perspective. They saw every look, every tense conversation, every chilly shoulder. And it becomes more difficult to ignore the reality every time Cheryl was questioned about the performance and responded with the same calm, aloof demeanor. And just when fans believed they had heard everything, some surprising details about Kate Jackson's background began to come to light. Kate Jackson adopted a different posture from Cheryl Ladd, who maintained her dignity and distance. Another kind of silence. She did not do many interviews throughout the years. She hardly ever mentioned Charlie's Angels when she did. That period of her life seems to have been closed off, hidden behind whispered regrets and unsolved conflict. People close to Kate have subtly hinted that there was more to her time on the show than just personality conflicts. She had been under a lot of personal strain. She fought severe health problems behind the scenes, including a diagnosis that required several surgeries. Furthermore, she was apparently upset with the course the show was following. Charlie's Angels was always more than simply action scenes in couture, according to Kate. She wanted drama, substance, and genuine acting challenges. However, she noticed that her influence was diminishing as the performance became more glitzy. Some people think that her working relationships suffered as a result of her displeasure. That Kate's developing disenchantment with the industry and herself may have contributed to Cheryl's feeling of coldness rather than it being wholly personal. It was more than simply a new co-star she had to deal with. She was struggling with physical pain, discouragement, and exhaustion. Regretfully, Cheryl might have been the object of such unjustified rage. Nevertheless, despite that background, Kate never apologized. She never publicly discussed the conflict, provided explanations, or provided closure. When asked if she kept in touch with her old co-stars in a rare interview from the late 1990s, she chuckled and responded, "No, I have moved on." That was a long time ago. Fans were left with more questions than answers after this deflection. Additionally, there were no acknowledgments, no apologies, and no efforts at a discreet, quiet reconciliation. That quiet might have been Cheryl's last reminder that nothing had changed and never would. Kate's quiet became a message in and of itself, whether it was due to pride, suffering, or just a wish to forget. And that quiet probably gave Cheryl the impression that the past would never be recognized, much less fixed. One thing was certain, regardless of the compassion Kate may have garnered from her personal hardships. It was more than simply a shattered bridge between her and Cheryl. It was scorched. Over the years, Cheryl Ladd created a life that was very different from Charlie's Angels' turmoil. She later published books, recorded music records, and starred in numerous television films. Her private life also prospered. She got married, started a family, and graciously and kindly accepted her position as a public person. She came to represent quiet tenacity to many, someone who had withstood the intense lights of Hollywood without becoming brittle. However, one thing remained constant. Kate Jackson and Cheryl Ladd were never reconciled. She never looked for reconciliation, and if it was provided, she never embraced it. According to industry insiders, Cheryl has declined multiple chances to rejoin the original group over the years, particularly if it meant sitting opposite from Kate. It had nothing to do with resentment. It has to do with limits. Cheryl has always remained calm when obliquely questioned about the long-standing dispute. She responds with consideration and compassion. She never sugarcoats the past, but she also doesn't relive old scars. More powerful than any tabloid headline is her quiet and composed unwillingness to participate. Cheryl opted for dignity in a field where scandals are sometimes transformed into sales pitches and resentments into publicity tours. She left the commotion behind and never turned around. Decades later, people are still curious about what went on behind those studio walls. Was it just a personality conflict? Was it more profound, stemming from fear, jealousy, or unresolved pain? Perhaps the whole tale will never be told. What's left is the fallout from a Cold War that never ended, even if Cheryl isn't interested in making amends, and Kate has long distanced herself from the public. When asked about forgiveness, which is not often, Cheryl answers thoughtfully. She is a believer in letting go, learning, and grace. However, she also thinks that you should keep your peace and avoid those that don't respect you. Cheryl Ladd didn't have to defend herself in the end. Her silence and her art speak for themselves. She remained loyal to herself throughout her lengthy and prosperous career. Furthermore, her actions demonstrated that forgiveness is not always necessary, even though she may never have said the words out. Moving on sometimes entails leaving and never coming back.